The IMF, the World Bank, they're part of a global economic architecture that was designed during colonial times. The United Nations itself was designed during colonial times, right? For a long time, the UN had less than 50 member states because the rest of the world was colonized. So it was the colonizers who established the UN, it's the colonizers who established the World Bank, the IMF, and who dominated the creation of the rest of the economic architecture. So an economic architecture that was not designed by us, that was not designed for us, why do we expect it to deliver justice for us today?
This is a small extract from what Professor Fadhel Kaboub, a renowned Tunisian economist, had to say about the hidden traps keeping Africa poor. He breaks down uncomfortable truths about food, energy, and technological dependency that most global powers would rather keep buried. Let's watch the rest of the video.
And the bonus of this bargain of the century is for workers globally, not just in the global south. Because when we in Africa and the rest of the global south, when our workers are busy manufacturing high value added content, the building blocks of development and prosperity, they're no longer available for those outsourced jobs to do assembly line manufacturing, which means workers in the global north are actually protected. Economic policy instructions dictated by the World Bank and IMF in particular for decades. The fact that we are still in a debt trap today, deeper in debt traps today, means one of two things. Either that these institutions are actually incompetent and we shouldn't listen to them, or they're actually doing this as part of their intentional economic entrapment. It's got to be one or the other. Either way, from our perspective, their model should be rejected. Their model of development, their instructions and prescriptions and conditionalities are designed to produce entrapment. So the manufacturing trap. So we talked about food deficits, energy deficits, the kind of manufacturing base that we were allowed to have. I use my words carefully here. Is the kind where we have to import the machines, we have to import the fuel to power the factories, we have to import the intermediate components to be assembled with low-cost labor, and we even import the packaging. So what we end up manufacturing and producing has low value-added content. But everything we import has high value-added content. So now we can double, triple, quadruple our exports with free trade agreements and partnerships and all that. It doesn't matter. You're always locked at the bottom of the hierarchy, at the bottom of the value chain. We have what we call a structural trade deficit, year after year, decade after decade. And the simple economics of trade deficit is the following. When a country has a trade deficit, like Kenya, like Tunisia, like the rest of the continent, your currency becomes weaker relative to the dollar. And we've seen this with the steady decline of the Kenyan shilling, the Egyptian pounds, the Tunisian dinar over decades. And it's not, if you look at the actual data, it's not related to any particular president or any particular crisis. Of course, those crises matters. Presidents and prime ministers matter. But this is a systemic trend that's been happening from day one after independence. So with the weaker shilling, everything we import the next morning, food, fuel, medicine, everything we import costs us more. So we literally import inflation in the most sensitive areas of our economy, food, fuel, medicine. But the most important thing that governments do is to ask the central bank to do their best to strengthen the exchange rate, to defend the exchange rate. And what central banks do as a band-aid solution is borrow more dollars so they can sustain the deficit. And that gets us deeper and deeper and deeper into the debt crisis, up to the point where nobody wants to lend you money anymore because you have too much debt. Then you're forced to go to the IMF, to the World Bank, and then they impose the conditionalities on you. And the conditionalities will force you to reprioritize your economic needs and your policy choices. So you prioritize economic activity that will generate dollars as quickly as possible so you can service the debt, so you can pay them back. More coffee exports, more flour exports, more tea exports, more extractive, right? And that means we don't have any money left in the budget to invest in the strategic transformation that we need, to invest in health and education and all the things that the young people in Kenya and Tunisia and other places aspire for their government to invest in. And those three structural traps, as I described, have colonial, post-colonial functions and serve to preserve a particular economic and geopolitical hierarchy in which the African continent is locked at the bottom by design. And again, it's our biggest energy potential, as I described earlier. It's not really fossil fuels. If fossil fuels were going to be the source of prosperity, Nigeria would be an economic powerhouse today, delivering aid and development to its neighbors, right? But Nigeria is energy poor because what we manufacture today is mostly products for other people to consume. But we want to prioritize three things to begin with. Number one, manufacture and deploy renewable energy infrastructure, because we have all the critical minerals we need for that. Number two, manufacture and deploy clean transportation infrastructure to build the logistics of development and prosperity. And number three, clean cooking infrastructure for the 950 million people on this continent who are inhaling toxic fumes on a daily basis, mostly women and children, because of lack of clean cooking infrastructure. Our problem in Africa is that most of our economies are small. My country is 11 million consumers. There's no way we can industrialize unless we have access to a larger market. The larger market exists globally, but good luck competing today with made in Germany, made in Japan, made in China. And why Pan-African? Because industrialization, real industrialization, requires what we call economies of scale. In other words, if I'm going to manufacture this microphone, if I manufacture and sell in a market of 10 million consumers, it's the price of this thing is going to be so expensive. But if I manufacture large volumes for a market of 500, 600, 1.5 billion consumers, I'm going to be able to hit those economies of scale. The larger the volume, the lower the cost per unit, the better the quality, then my innovation, research and development, all the benefits of industrialization start to kick in. But if we have a regional or at least Pan-African market of our own, then we can produce those economies of scale. We can have multiple manufacturers competing in a healthy way, producing all those benefits. The nice thing about Pan-African industrial policy is not just the economies of scale, which we have to have, but it's also the fact that we have the complementarity of resources and capabilities. We have all the resources that we want, the critical minerals especially. We have the youngest labor force on the planet is on the African continent. The missing piece, in addition to our leaders recognizing that they need to work together by necessity, the missing piece is access to the manufacturing technology, which is, as I described, is available everywhere else. In Europe and China and Japan, is being withheld from us. Imagine this scenario for a moment. Imagine a block of, say, 20, 30 African countries, even African and other countries from the rest of the global south, as a block, coming together without China, coming together and saying, we want to co-design a joint industrial policy that we pre-negotiate on our terms, so that in that block you don't have, South Africa at the top of the hierarchy and Malawi at the bottom of the hierarchy, but really just an equitable development process. And we as a block have all the resources, the youngest labor force, and we want to start real industrialization to replicate the entire value chain of manufacturing, for example, solar panels. And then we'll deploy those solar panels so that we actually address one of the major root causes. And this is just the beginning of this Pan-African Global South partnership. We have all the resources, but we lack the manufacturing technology. The one country that is actually most likely willing to share the technology is China, because it has the entire value chain that we want. So we go to China with the bargain of the century and say, look, if you share your technology, as in joint venture, it's not a gift, you partner with us, in-kind contribution to replicate the entire value chain on terms that are favorable to us and this block of country, and start manufacturing and deploying renewable energy infrastructure at scale, here's what we give you in return. In 10 to 15 years, you double your industrial footprint globally. In 10 to 15 years, you double your geopolitical weight globally. And you secure access to these precious minerals that everybody's panicking about. In addition to that, because of the recent trade restrictions on Chinese high-tech products, batteries, EVs, and so on in Europe and the United States, we tell China, look, we in the global south, we're the global majority. We're the biggest consumer market on the planet, bigger than the US, Europe, Australia, Japan combined. The problem is we're not your customers yet because we don't have purchasing power. But if we truly industrialize and develop, we'll have purchasing power to give you the largest market on the planet. So I guarantee you China will accept this bargain. will actually partner to start the real process of development. Just triggering the process of this bargain with China
Yes.
immediately gives us the second bargaining chip we need to reposition the African continent by going to countries in Europe, for example, Germany, and say, look, we give you the same bargain that we give to China. If you transfer and share technology to replicate the production of wind turbine technology, for example. At that point, Germany can't say no, because they know if they reject our offer, we go to China and give them an opportunity to get even a bigger global share of geopolitics. And we go to France and say, we would like to give you the same bargain
Yes.
if you replicate the production of high-speed rail. We go to the US and say, particular pharmaceutical technology that we want to manufacture and deploy in the African continent. At that point, they can't say no, because China has high-speed rail, China has pharmaceuticals. So the idea of this bargain is not to position China at the top of the hierarchy, but rather to force the repositioning of Africa and the global south at the center of a new international economic order. If you take their collective visions for their own development, it assumes by definition that there will be no critical minerals left for the African continent to develop. That is an unspoken assumption. But as we do this, we force a real conversation about reducing energy waste, living within planetary boundaries, getting rid of planned obsolescence, consumerism, waste, and creating truly circular economies of sustainability, and thinking about degrowth, which, not for us, because we need to grow. Degrowth as in the countries that excessively waste resources. Degrowth means you have higher quality of life in a circular economy, sustainable economy. Our leaders need to recognize that the solutions, if we're going to the roots of the problem, right, have to be, number one, strategic investments in food sovereignty, not food security, and agroecology, which happens to be, by the way, a solution to the debt crisis, but it's also a climate solution. It's a win-win, right? So we're not competing with priorities here. Number two, strategic investments in renewable energy sovereignty, not renewable energy to export to Europe, to prioritize producing energy
For its own people.
for the 600 plus million people today who have no access to electricity to begin with, right? And how can you have development without energy? No country can function without energy. And number three, Pan-African, and I insist on Pan-African, at least regional industrial policies, joint industrial policies to manufacture and deploy the building blocks of development and prosperity. Yeah, we see this constantly. Everybody has a vision for Africa, has a plan for Africa, and all of them can be, fit into one filing cabinet, colonial plans. The World Bank produced a recent report with estimates for climate displacement. And the numbers are shocking. The World Bank is a very conservative institution. The study that they produced very conservative numbers, but they're numbers that we've never seen, the magnitude of that kind. The World Bank is estimating by 2050 there'll be 216 million people globally displaced by climate events. More than 100 million on the African continent. And that's a very conservative estimate. So when people are displaced internally, right, it puts more pressure on resources, on food, housing, jobs, and so on. And it tends to exacerbate conflict. And when you have displacement of that kind, people usually cross borders. And people usually think about, finding a better place for their family. It's not going to be the neighboring country anymore, because the neighboring country is going to be suffering just as much. So even if a small percentage of that number decides to make their way to Tunisia and then into Italy, it will be the biggest refugee crisis we've seen in the history of the world. What kind of investments will produce those transformations? Now, had Italy or the G7 or all the other participants in this plan, had they looked at Agenda 2063, which is the African Union vision for Africa, you would find some basic pillars of development and prosperity that will actually work, right? And the Matai plan didn't even mention or make reference to Africa's vision for Africa. They said, we have a vision to fix this, and we're going to bring our own companies to invest, basically to extract green energy green ammonia, right? Which is fertilizers for agriculture. The question then becomes, what are we doing with the fertilizers? Are we going to use fertilizers so we can enhance our food sovereignty by producing more core crops on the African continent? Or is this European investment in fertilizers designed to feed into cash crop exports, coffee, tea, tobacco, and get us deeper into the trap? This thing that we're calling climate finance and green investment in Mauritania is actually locking Mauritania in the same colonial role as the place for cheap raw materials to extract resources from it, and as the consumer of industrial output and food and everything from the global north. And it's designed to strengthen the EU position in manufacturing industrial output, except now it's greenwashed, of course. And you see this across the continent, the green industrial zone in Namibia. All of these things are purely extractive, a greenwash, rinse and repeat of the same colonial hierarchy. Now, the African Union is mostly funded by the European Union and other donors. So if our core decision-making Pan-African process is funded by our competitors, let's call them, right? Why do we expect them to fund the very core things that will make us less dependent on them, that will make us truly their competitors? And in some areas, in the long term, we may actually dominate them economically. You should not expect the EU or the US or any other external donor to fund a process that will make you stronger than them in the long term. So the funding is not going to come from there. In addition to that, each one of our member states, if they're going to activate these, this vision with financial resources, we talked earlier about how we do our finance bills in Kenya and Tunisia. The first thing that any finance bill looks at is how much money we have to set aside to service the debt. So that is the reason why we have these wonderful documents, because in order for us to reposition the African continent with these transformative investments, we have to have a geopolitical leverage. You can't go to COP and beg for 1 trillion or 2 trillion or 5 trillion. I made a joke the other day. I said, we can go to COP and ask for $10 of climate finance. I guarantee you we will not get it. Right? Because it's a question of, we have no leverage, right? And that's why we designed this geopolitical strategic vision that is the bargain of the century, what I described earlier, as a way to create that leverage, to actually force the conversation and force the transfer of technology and the repositioning of the African continent.
If what Professor Fadhel Kaboub shared opened your eyes, then it's time to raise your voice. What do you think is holding Africa back? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Let's keep this conversation going. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more bold and honest discussions like this.